Most people still think of space as science. Rockets, astronauts, moon landings, satellites, government missions, national prestige. And that is still part of the story. But it is no longer the whole story, because space is becoming something else too. An economy, not a future economy, not a distant economy. An economy that is already forming now. Launch systems, satellite networks, defense contracts, navigation systems, communications infrastructure, Earth observation, lunar programs, private capital, industrial supply chains. This is not just exploration anymore. It is economic territory. That is why the new space economy has already begun. Not because humanity suddenly moved beyond Earth, but because the systems that support life on Earth are becoming more dependent on what happens above it. People often talk about space in two old ways, either as a government prestige project or as a science fiction fantasy. That framing misses what is changing. Because the modern space story is becoming much more practical, space is increasingly tied to communications, mapping, weather, logistics, military positioning, financial timing, internet access, surveillance, resource planning, and industrial competition. That means space is no longer separate from the economy below. It is being woven into it, and once something becomes essential to communication, security, coordination, and infrastructure, it stops being symbolic. It becomes economic. That is the deeper shift. Space is not only a place people want to reach, it is a system people want to build on top of. The new space economy did not begin with the moon. It began much closer to Earth. Satellites already shape daily life in ways most people rarely think about. Navigation depends on them. Weather forecasting depends on them. Communications depend on them. Television depends on them. Military operations depend on them. Global timing systems depend on them. Shipping and aviation depend on them. Financial networks depend on synchronized time. That matters, because once modern systems depend on orbital infrastructure, space stops being optional. It becomes part of how the economy functions. And when infrastructure becomes essential, someone has to build it, protect it, finance it, replace it, and compete for control over it. That is how a scientific frontier becomes an economic one. For a long time, space remained expensive enough that only governments could play seriously. That limited the pace of expansion. Missions were rarer, hardware was costly, access to orbit was tightly constrained, commercial activity remained narrower. Then launch economics started changing. Reusable rockets, private launch providers, and more frequent missions began lowering the cost of getting payloads into orbit. That did not make space cheap, but it made it more usable. And usability changes everything. Because once launch becomes less rare and more repeatable, space becomes easier to commercialize. More satellites can be deployed, more systems can be tested, more private firms can participate, more infrastructure can be layered into orbit. That is one of the clearest reasons the new space economy accelerated. Lower access cost created a bigger economic surface. This is the key shift. The most important space activity is increasingly not spectacle. It is infrastructure. That means less focus on one-off wonder and more focus on systems that operate continuously. Satellite constellations, navigation layers, remote sensing networks, defense positioning systems, Earth monitoring platforms, launch logistics, communications relays, lunar support architecture. These are not just exciting headlines. They are the building blocks of a larger operating system. And infrastructure has a very different logic from exploration. It requires maintenance, capital, redundancy, standards, security, supply chains, and long-term strategic planning. Once space becomes infrastructure, the question changes. It is no longer just, can we go there? It becomes who builds it, who controls it, and who depends on it. This is not a story of governments disappearing. Governments still matter enormously. They fund missions, they set priorities, they shape regulations, they support defense applications, they anchor major contracts. But governments are no longer acting alone. Private firms now build, launch, operate, service, and compete inside this system. That changes the structure of the space economy. Instead of a purely state-led model, you get a mixed model. Public money, private execution, strategic partnerships, commercial competition, and long-term industrial dependence. That makes space feel more like other strategic sectors. Energy, defense, semiconductors, telecommunications. Space is starting to resemble those industries: publicly important, privately built, and geopolitically significant. This is one reason the space economy matters so much. It is not only commercial, it is strategic. A country with stronger space systems has advantages in communications, surveillance, navigation, missile warning, reconnaissance, military coordination, and national resilience. That means space is now deeply linked to security and geopolitical competition. And once a sector becomes strategically important, investment increases, competition intensifies, and redundancy becomes more valuable. That is why space should not be viewed as a side industry. It is becoming part of the architecture of power, and industries tied to power rarely stay small for long. One of the clearest commercial examples is Earth observation. Space-based imaging and sensing can now support agriculture, insurance, disaster planning, climate monitoring, shipping analysis, military intelligence, resource tracking, urban development, and infrastructure management. That matters because observation becomes monetizable when it improves decisions. If a company can see crop conditions earlier, track traffic patterns faster, monitor fires, spot flood risk, or understand infrastructure stress, that data becomes economically useful. And when data becomes useful, it becomes investable. This is how the new space economy grows, not only by going farther, but by turning space-based information into economic advantage on Earth. This is where people often get confused. They think lunar missions are mainly symbolic. In reality, the moon matters because it extends infrastructure outward. A return to the moon is not just about flags or prestige. It is about proving transport systems, life support systems, orbital coordination, industrial partnerships, landing systems, communication systems, and long-duration operating capability. In other words, the moon becomes a testbed, a place where governments and companies learn how to build the next layer of off-Earth infrastructure. That is why lunar activity matters economically. It is not only the destination, it is the rehearsal space for a larger industrial future. If space becomes bigger, its supply chains become bigger too. Rockets need materials, satellites need chips, guidance systems need sensors, launches need fuel systems, ground operations need software, defense applications need secure hardware, factories need skilled labor, programs need financing. That means the new space economy is not only about launch sites and astronauts, it also reaches into manufacturing, advanced materials, electronics, software, aerospace engineering, communications, national defense, and industrial labor markets. This is important because once supply chains deepen, the sector becomes more embedded in the wider economy. That makes it more durable. An economy is not created by headlines alone. It is created when production chains, capital flows, and dependency networks begin to form around an activity. That is already happening in space. Another major difference now is the role of capital. Old space models moved more slowly because they depended heavily on public budgets and state priorities. Now private capital can accelerate parts of the system. It can fund launch firms, satellite ventures, communications plays, data businesses, and aerospace manufacturing. That does not remove risk. In fact, it can create new volatility, but it does change speed. Because once investors believe a sector may support recurring infrastructure, defense relevance, or high-value data services, capital starts moving toward it faster. That is how industries scale. First through strategic necessity, then through financial belief, then through industrial buildup. Space is moving through that pattern now. This is worth understanding. The new space economy probably will not first arrive as a science fiction society in orbit. It will likely arrive in more ordinary ways. Better satellite coverage, more commercial launch, more orbital infrastructure, more Earth data services, more military dependency, more private-public integration, more communications competition, more logistics coordination from above Earth. In other words, the first phase may feel boring compared with the fantasy, but boring infrastructure is often where the real money is. Pipes are boring, grids are boring, ports are boring, cables are boring, until you realize modern life depends on them. That is how space is changing. Less fantasy, more infrastructure, and infrastructure is where economic power settles. The new space economy has already begun because space is becoming part of the operating system of Earth. It now supports communication, timing, navigation, observation, security, industrial planning, and geopolitical competition. Launch costs change the access problem. Private firms changed the participation model. Governments kept the strategic stakes high, and infrastructure demand made the sector more durable. That is the deeper pattern. Space is no longer only a frontier to visit. It is becoming a layer to build on. And once a frontier becomes buildable, it becomes economic. Most people still imagine space as distant, but economically, it is getting closer. Closer to communications, closer to logistics, closer to defense, closer to data, closer to infrastructure, closer to daily life. That is why the new space economy has already begun. Not because humanity has left Earth behind, but because more of Earth's future is being built through systems above it. And once those systems become essential, space stops being a side project. It becomes part of the economy that decides what comes next.